In the grand oak-paneled study of Richard, Thorne's estate, where oil paintings of stern ancestors lined the walls and the scent of expensive leather and aged scotch, hung in the air an invisible storm brewed behind the gleaming surface of wealth and order. Richard, a millionaire many times over, and a man who had clawed his way to the top by stepping on the shoulders of those beneath him, paced furiously behind his mahogany desk, barking into his phone, his voice sharp with entitlement and barely restrained fury. He was used to control, to precision, to a world that bent itself around his demands, but now that illusion was crumbling. On the table before him lay a stack of crucial legal documents, contracts in a foreign language for an overseas merger that could elevate his empire or shatter it. His translator, a high-paid professional he'd flown in from overseas, had just emailed with a bland apology, citing an emergency and leaving him stranded with hours ticking down to a deadline. His fury burned hot and loud, but it barely registered with the maid silently dusting the bookshelf in the corner. Sarah Vance, dressed in a plain navy uniform and worn white sneakers, moved with quiet precision, her eyes lowered, her presence intentionally muted. To Richard, she was background noise, a fixture like the fireplace or the rug beneath his feet, useful only so long as she stayed silent and invisible. Yet Sarah heard everything. She always did. For months she had worked quietly in the Thorne estate, ignored, overlooked, underestimated, and that suited her just fine. She had no need for attention, no desire for recognition. But today something shifted. Richard's voice was now an escalating mess of panic and profanity. He slammed his phone onto the desk and muttered bitterly, "I'd give half my fortune just to make sense of this damn language." Sarah paused, her duster resting lightly on the edge of a bookshelf. She looked down at the ornate carpet, weighing a decision. Her mother had once warned her that speaking up in rooms like these came with risks, especially for people like her, people whose value was measured only by how well they stayed silent. But her father, a quiet scholar who taught her 5 languages before she was 16, had given her something even more powerful than caution: knowledge. She turned slowly and in a voice soft but clear said, "It's Hungarian. Those are standard merger clauses regarding shareholder protections." Richard spun around, momentarily stunned, as if the armchair had spoken. He squinted at her, disbelief written across his face. "What did you say?" he asked, more insulted than curious. "I said it's Hungarian," she replied, standing a little straighter. "The phrasing on page 3 references Article 21B of their corporate law code. I studied comparative law during my degree." Her voice didn't waver, though her heart thudded loudly in her chest. Richard stared at her, torn between skepticism and desperation. He walked over, picking up the papers with shaking hands and thrusting them at her. "Translate the first 2 pages, he ordered, still half convinced this was some elaborate joke. Sarah took the papers gently, sat at the side table, and began to work. Her pen moved with certainty, her eyes scanning swiftly, her translations precise, complete, and clean. Within minutes, Richard's expression shifted from doubt to awe, then to something unfamiliar: unease. For the first time in a very long time, he had to recognize intelligence in someone whose worth he had dismissed entirely. When she handed back the papers, he muttered a thank you that caught awkwardly in his throat, as if the words had never been used for someone like her before. But Sarah didn't linger for praise. She returned to the bookshelf and continued dusting, her place in the room re-established as silent background help, just the way the world had trained her to be. Only now Richard couldn't unsee what he had ignored. The balance of power had tilted just slightly but irrevocably. He had built a life on assumptions, that money bought loyalty, that titles meant wisdom, that uniforms indicated limits. But Sarah had exposed the cracks in that belief, not with defiance but with quiet brilliance. As the late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, warming the old hardwood floors, Richard sat back down, no longer pacing. The documents were no longer foreign. The crisis was over, but something deeper had been disturbed. The awareness that genius could wear sneakers and dust bookshelves, and that in the very house he ruled, someone had been silently fluent in everything he didn't understand. Not just language, but humility, dignity, and quiet power. The tension in the room was thick and electric, every pair of eyes silently tracking the tremors of a meeting on the verge of unraveling. When Richard, red-faced with frustration and clutching the untranslated foreign documents that no one on his team could decipher, suddenly turned towards Sarah, the young black maid standing quietly by the side, holding a tray of empty coffee cups. There was a glint of desperation in his eye, masked by arrogance, and as he held the pages aloft, he let out a sharp, cruel laugh that drew the attention of the room like a spark in dry grass. "You," he said, his voice slicing through the silence with performative disdain. "Translate this and my salary is yours." His tone was mocking, theatrical, fully intended to humiliate, not just challenge. The laughter that followed was hesitant, nervous chuckles from colleagues unsure whether to join in or recoil. It wasn't really a joke, and yet Richard treated it as such, leaning into the audacity of his own arrogance. To him, Sarah was a prop in his performance, a background character in his drama, a maid in a uniform, insignificant and uneducated, someone whose very presence he felt entitled to belittle. His words weren't just an insult to her intelligence, they were an attack on her existence, a public declaration that her value was limited to the task of cleaning, that her mind couldn't possibly grasp what his team of professionals had failed to understand. But Sarah, poised and calm despite the sting of his words, didn't flinch. She simply set the tray down on the nearest table, stepped forward with grace, and held out her hand for the papers. There was a beat of silence, subtle but charged, as she looked Richard in the eye, not with defiance, but with something far more unsettling to a man like him: quiet confidence. No smugness, no retaliation, just presence. She took the documents from his hand as gently as one might pluck a feather from the air, and began to read. At first Richard smirked, assuming she was pretending. But as her eyes moved steadily across the text, and her fingers traced under the lines with the fluency of someone who not only understood the language but had lived in its syntax, something subtle began to shift. The room fell completely still. Those who had moments ago chuckled began exchanging uncertain glances. One of the senior partners furrowed his brow. Another leaned in, and Richard, still standing, still sneering, now wore the brittle edge of forced confidence, as if trying to convince himself that what he was witnessing wasn't possible. Sarah's voice, soft but unwavering, began to translate, line by line, clause by clause, not hesitating, not stumbling. The words rolled out of her with practiced ease, her tone professional, deliberate, and with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The language, complex legal Mandarin, was one even Richard had only pretended to understand. The document wasn't just a memo. It was a revised contract with multiple embedded clauses, time-sensitive amendments, and implications that affected millions in company liability. As Sarah continued, her translation not only captured the exact legal terminology, but also the cultural nuance buried in the phrasing, an understanding that even high-level consultants sometimes failed to grasp. The silence in the room turned from awkward to reverent, as realization swept across the faces of those present. Sarah was not just translating. She was revealing, unraveling a knot that had stumped an entire room of executives, and she did it with the grace and humility of someone who had nothing to prove, yet everything to show. Richard's face turned pale, the blood draining from his expression as the weight of his insult crashed back onto him with crushing force. In trying to humiliate her, he had revealed his own ignorance, loud, clumsy, and exposed in front of his peers. His offer, meant to mock, now hung in the air like an open wound. "Translate this and my salary is yours," he had said. The irony was poetic, almost cruel in its symmetry, but Sarah said nothing about that. She finished reading, placed the papers on the table, nodded politely, and stepped back, once again blending into the periphery, not because she belonged there, but because she chose it. Her power wasn't in dominance, but in clarity, and that clarity had pierced through every assumption in the room like sunlight through stained glass. In that moment she had transformed, no longer the maid, but the most informed, most intelligent, and most composed person in the room. The others, still stunned, looked to Richard, who now stood motionless, humiliated not by her words, but by her silence. And that silence, far louder than any confrontation, echoed with a quiet truth: that dignity requires no permission, and brilliance needs no title. A heavy silence blanketed the sleek boardroom, broken only by the faint rustling of papers and the distant hum of city traffic filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sarah stood at the far end of the polished table, her presence barely acknowledged moments earlier, now suddenly the center of attention. Just minutes ago, Richard had scoffed at her involvement, dismissing her with, a wave of his hand and a smirk curling on his lips. "Maybe she can fetch us more coffee," he'd muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, eliciting scattered chuckles from the senior partners seated around him. He had mocked her quiet demeanor, her youth, her role, assuming she was merely an assistant tagging along, not a qualified legal strategist with 2 postgraduate degrees and a sharp understanding of cross-border mergers. But now as she began to speak, his smirk faltered. Her voice, calm and clear, carried across the table like a blade slicing through the awkward air. In fluent, technical Mandarin, she started to translate the dense legal documents that had just been handed over. Pages of complex clauses outlining intellectual property rights, joint venture responsibilities, and equity stake regulations. But she didn't stop at mere translation. With a fluency not just of language but of law and strategy, Sarah dissected each clause, articulating its implications in both business and legal terms. Her explanations were neither hurried nor defensive. Instead, each sentence was delivered with a steady, composed confidence that resonated with clarity. As she moved from clause to clause, she addressed not only the foreign investors at the table but also her own team, bridging 2 worlds with intellect and grace. The Chinese delegates, who had been stone-faced and guarded, began to nod in approval, clearly surprised and impressed by her depth of knowledge and the cultural fluency with which she navigated both languages and expectations. Every word she spoke turned the tide, drawing attention away from Richard's earlier bluster and toward a truth too powerful to ignore. Richard's laughter had died the moment she opened her mouth, and now his face shifted from amusement to disbelief, his fingers twitching nervously as if reaching for something to anchor himself. The color drained slowly from his cheeks as he realized that Sarah wasn't just competent, she was the smartest person in the room, and he had publicly underestimated her. His authority, once bolstered by arrogance and assumptions, crumbled with every word she spoke. Around the table, the shift in energy was palpable. Partners who had barely acknowledged her before now leaned forward, listening intently, and even the most skeptical executives exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Who is she? Yet Sarah didn't gloat. She didn't pause to soak in their astonishment or capitalize on their discomfort. Her focus remained fixed on clarity and resolution. The legal tangle they'd all considered nearly impossible to navigate was being unraveled before their eyes. Not by a veteran partner, but by the young woman they had almost dismissed from the room. In that moment, Sarah didn't need to raise her voice or assert her credentials. Her knowledge was its own declaration. And still, as brilliant as her analysis was, it was the grace with which she delivered it, the calm, unwavering poise, that turned this moment from impressive to unforgettable. She had no interest in proving Richard wrong or claiming personal victory. Her only goal was to serve the deal, to protect her client, to do the work no one thought she could do. But the room knew, they all knew. The revelation of her intellect was more than professional. It was emotional. It was the triumph of a person long overlooked, of someone who had been underestimated not because of her abilities, but because of her silence, her gender, her age, her quiet confidence mistaken for lack of substance. And now those very traits, her restraint, her precision, her calm under pressure, became her greatest weapons. When she finally closed the binder and took a small step back, there was no applause, no dramatic ending, just stunned silence, the kind that echoes louder than words. Even Richard, now visibly flustered, struggled to find a response. His earlier confidence had collapsed under the weight of his own prejudice. Sarah gave him a brief glance, not cruel, not smug, just firm and full of clarity. It was the look of someone who no longer needed to justify her place at the table. The story of that day wouldn't just be remembered as the deal that almost failed. It would be retold as the moment when quiet brilliance outshone loud arrogance, when competence silenced condescension, and when the room finally saw who Sarah really was, not an assistant, not a note-taker, but a force. And as the meeting continued with renewed focus, it was clear to everyone that the power in the room had shifted, irreversibly and rightfully, toward the woman who had dared to speak when it mattered most. The conference room was still, so still it felt as though even the air had frozen in anticipation, as Sarah gently placed the translated documents on the polished table and slid them across to Richard. The tension in the room hung heavy, thick with the echoes of what had just unfolded. Moments ago, Sarah, calm, precise, and unflinching, had flawlessly translated the complex business agreement from Mandarin to English in front of a room full of astonished executives, foreign investors, and most notably, Richard himself. It was only an hour earlier that he had laughed off her presence, dismissing her as little more than background noise, a glorified assistant, a nobody. He had publicly mocked her qualifications and, with a smirk of arrogance, challenged anyone in the room to translate the final contract without error if they wanted a raise, certain no one would dare or be capable. He hadn't expected her to speak up. He hadn't expected her to step forward. But she had. And now, as he looked down at the papers, each line of Mandarin perfectly transcribed, every nuance intact, every idiom flawlessly interpreted, his expression crumbled from smug superiority to pale disbelief. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Silence clung to him like a shadow. Sarah, standing tall and steady, met his eyes with the same unwavering composure that had carried her through the entire moment. She didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice, didn't even blink. She didn't need to. Her presence alone had spoken louder than any outburst could. And then, with a voice as calm as it was cutting, she reminded him, reminded all of them, of the words he had so confidently thrown out earlier. "My new salary," she said, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact, "is due on Friday." The room didn't erupt, but it vibrated with an unspoken sense of justice, a silent storm of emotion that swept across the faces of those present. A few eyes widened, a few jaws dropped, and somewhere in the back, someone let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Sarah's words were not just a request. They were a mirror held up to Richard's ego and arrogance, reflecting back every ounce of condescension he had flung her way. He had made a challenge, confident that no one would rise to meet it, and now he stood publicly undone by the very person he had deemed unworthy. The moment was deeply satisfying, not because Sarah had humiliated him intentionally, but because she hadn't needed to. The truth had done that for her. The undeniable brilliance of her work, her poise under pressure, and her ability to remain grounded while others had underestimated her. That was her justice. It wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. Richard, now visibly flushed, struggled to compose himself, but there was no salvaging his pride. His authority, once built on fear and bluster, had crumbled under the weight of his own words. Sarah, who had always done her work quietly, diligently, without fanfare, had not only risen to the occasion, she had redefined it. In that moment, she became a symbol of something far greater than a translator or an employee. She became a quiet champion for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or spoken over. Her victory was not just personal, it was universal. It reminded people that dignity doesn't come from titles, and value isn't always loud or showy. Sometimes, the most powerful people in the room are the ones who don't need to say much at all. As Sarah turned and walked away, the room remained silent. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because they knew anything they said now would pale in comparison to what had just been demonstrated. Richard remained seated, staring down at the translated pages, the paper in front of him more damning than any accusation. He had underestimated her. He had weaponized pride. And now he sat silenced by his own arrogance. Sarah didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had said everything she needed to with that single sentence, and with the strength, grace, and intelligence that no one could ever again deny. To the casual observer, Sarah was simply a maid, quiet, efficient, and invisible. Just another uniformed figure blending into the periphery of luxury offices and opulent hallways. But beneath her calm exterior and modest posture was a mind that once captivated the academic world. Sarah was a former prodigy, a woman who held dual doctorates in advanced linguistics and international law by the age of 27. Her brilliance once lighting up lecture halls and conference stages. Her intellect had earned her acclaim, but acclaim had never been her goal. What Sarah sought was truth, pure, unfiltered, and often buried beneath layers of ego, wealth, and power. She knew the world didn't always bend for the brilliant, especially not for women like her, who were expected to dazzle from a distance, but remain silent when the system showed its cracks. It was this realization that led her to make an unthinkable choice. She walked away from academia and the law firms that competed to have her name on their mastheads. Instead, she chose anonymity. She chose the uniform. She chose the broom. And she did so deliberately, not as an act of surrender but of strategy. Working as a maid gave her something no position of prestige ever had: access to the truth behind closed doors. It allowed her to walk through the very heart of the elite's world, to listen while others talked freely, carelessly, assuming she lacked the capacity to understand. But Sarah understood everything. She watched boardroom betrayals unfold while she polished brass doorknobs. She heard slurs masked as jokes as she cleared half-finished glasses of champagne. She read documents left open on laptops and witnessed the quiet arrogance of men like Richard. Men who thought they were untouchable, invincible, above consequence. Richard, in particular, fascinated and disgusted her. His charm was polished, his suits expensive, his smile rehearsed, but Sarah saw past the mask. She saw the way he spoke down to people, the way he manipulated trust, the way he hid his corruption beneath philanthropy and handshakes, and she had made it her mission to expose him, not out of revenge but from a place of deeper justice. She wasn't working for money or fame or recognition. She didn't need any of it. What she wanted was for people like Richard to be seen for what they truly were, and for people like her, silent observers, underestimated minds, to be reminded of their power. There were nights Sarah would return to her modest apartment and translate everything she had heard into a growing dossier. Dates, names, schemes, lies. She documented patterns of unethical decisions and quiet settlements. She mapped the social web of deception that Richard operated within. Every note meticulously catalogued, every fact verified with the precision of a scholar and the instinct of a strategist. The emotional weight of her mission was immense. There were moments of loneliness when her brilliance felt like a burden, hidden under layers of borrowed humility. There were moments when she questioned whether living among lies had changed her, hardened her. But what kept her steady was the knowledge that truth had value, even if no one saw her, even if no one applauded her, even if the justice she pursued remained unspoken. The disguise gave her power. It gave her agency in a world that had once tried to define her by her intellect and then confine her because of it. Her silence was not submission, it was precision. Her role was not servitude, it was surveillance. And the day would come when all that she had seen, all that she had heard, all that she had learned while moving unnoticed through the world of the powerful would crystallize into something unstoppable. Her presence, once overlooked, would become impossible to ignore. In many ways, Sarah embodied the truth about brilliance, that it doesn't always need a spotlight, that sometimes the brightest minds walk the quietest paths, and that real genius isn't just about what you know, it's what you choose to do with what you know. Her backstory was not one of tragedy but of transformation. It was about reclaiming power through patience, exposing lies through silence, and watching the world from the shadows until the moment came to step forward, not as a maid, not as an academic, but as the unseen genius who saw it all, remembered everything, and waited just long enough to bring it all down with a whisper. The room still carried the weight of Richard's public humiliation, his once commanding presence dimmed under the fluorescent lights, his suit slightly disheveled and his confidence, once rock-solid, visibly cracked. Yet even stripped of his arrogance's glossy veneer, Richard was a pragmatist to the core. He knew the stakes and, more importantly, he knew talent when he saw it. Sarah, the quiet maid whose intelligence had just salvaged a delicate international meeting, was the asset he could no longer afford to ignore. So, swallowing what pride he had left, he approached her, awkwardly as if each step toward her was a concession. His attempt at an apology came out stiff and half-hearted, the words misshapen by the arrogance that still clung to his voice like an oil slick. "I may have misjudged you," he said, not looking her in the eye. "You're clearly too smart to be a maid." The words, meant as a compliment, landed like a slap. Sarah didn't flinch, but inside she felt the sting of being reduced again, not praised for her skill or intelligence, but measured against the perceived inferiority of her job. Yet her expression remained unreadable, poised, professional. Richard then offered her a new position, head translator with a generous salary and benefits, wrapped in a veneer of opportunity but reeking of desperation. She could hear it in his tone. This wasn't respect, it was necessity. He needed her, but he still didn't fully see her. He wanted her skills, not her dignity. And perhaps worst of all, he still believed himself to be in control of the situation. But Sarah had changed in the course of that single day. What had begun as just another shift in uniform had become a turning point in her story. She was no longer the silent observer cleaning around power. She had become the center of it. She met his gaze with calm confidence, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the power imbalance to tip. Then she spoke, her voice even but firm, her tone that of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to claim. "I'll accept," she said, watching his eyes flicker with relief. "But on my terms." His brows furrowed slightly, unused to negotiation from someone he had once brushed off. "I choose my team. I report directly to the board, not to you. And I want a formal apology, written, not just to me, but to the entire staff, especially those who've worked under your thumb." Richard's jaw tightened, the muscles twitching beneath the weight of indignation. He wasn't used to giving power. He was used to wielding it. But Sarah wasn't making a request. She was setting boundaries. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that she was no longer negotiating for a place at the table. She was flipping the table entirely. The roles had reversed, and the maid he had once dismissed now held the pen that would redraw the lines of control. Richard begrudgingly nodded. "Fine," he muttered. But Sarah wasn't finished. She stepped forward, closing the space between them just slightly, her eyes unwavering. "And let me be clear," she said softly but with unmistakable strength. "This isn't you offering me something. This is me allowing you to salvage what little credibility you have left." The room seemed to still at her words, and even Richard couldn't hide the flicker of something rare. Respect, perhaps even fear. It wasn't about revenge for Sarah. It was about reclaiming her agency. She had spent too long watching people like him maneuver the world with unchecked entitlement, and now, standing in front of him, she saw it for what it was: fragile, performative, and deeply insecure. For her, accepting the job wasn't submission. It was reclamation. It was the opportunity to dismantle the system from within, to make space for others like her, intelligent, hard-working, and overlooked. As she walked away from Richard, the offer letter in hand, her posture was straight, her shoulders squared, and her eyes ahead. She had accepted his offer, yes, but not because he gave it. Because she chose to. And that distinction made all the difference. Richard watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and regret. He had tried to fix the surface without ever acknowledging the depth. But Sarah had forced him, and everyone else in the room, to see what true power looked like when it came not from privilege or position, but from character, clarity, and courage. The final insult he'd intended as a compliment, "You're too smart to be a maid," had only revealed his ignorance. Sarah didn't rise despite being a maid. She had always been more than that. Her job had never defined her. Her choices did. And today, she had chosen not just a title, but a future that she would shape on her own terms. The transformation within the gleaming walls of Grayson Enterprises was not just a corporate shift. It was personal, profound, and painfully overdue. Sarah, once invisible in her crisp maid's uniform, now walked the marble floors of the executive wing in tailored suits, her presence commanding and her authority undeniable. What had once been whispered dismissively as the help had now become the respected voice in boardrooms, the architect of reforms and the moral compass for a company built too long on ego and silent hierarchy. Her rise wasn't meteoric. It was earned step by deliberate step through quiet observation, painful endurance, and an unyielding belief that respect should not be dictated by title or wardrobe. As she moved through her new role as Chief Ethics Officer, Sarah brought with her not just policies and structure, but purpose. She dismantled outdated hierarchies, instituted fair wage audits, created anonymous reporting systems, and held empathy seminars that compelled even the most jaded executives to see the people they once overlooked. Yet the most delicate shift of all was the one taking place between Sarah and Richard Grayson, the man who once barely acknowledged her presence, whose empire had been jolted by the realization that the maid cleaning his office had been sent to investigate his own corruption. The balance of power had turned with the quiet force of a tide, and now it was Richard who found himself waiting outside conference rooms she led, adjusting his tone when he spoke to her, and grappling with the unsettling truth that the person he had once underestimated was now the very person holding the company, perhaps even his reputation, together. For Richard, every interaction with Sarah now was a mirror reflecting his former self. The dismissive comments, the tone laced with superiority, the quiet complicity in a culture that prized power over people. He was learning in real time what it meant to be humbled, not by scandal alone, but by the dignity of the woman who had chosen not vengeance but reform. Sarah, though in a position to seek retribution, never did. She treated him professionally, firmly, and with a grace that often left him reeling. She didn't lecture him or gloat, but each time she corrected him in a meeting or redirected a decision with better judgment, it cut through him more deeply than any public reprimand could. The emotional struggle Richard faced was not about losing power. It was about facing the internal rot that had festered under the surface of his leadership. The prejudice, the arrogance, the inability to see value beyond pedigree. Now he had no choice but to rely on Sarah, not just because of her insight, but because his employees trusted her more than him. They came to her with concerns, ideas, even gratitude, not just for the reforms, but for being seen finally as human beings. Sarah never brought up the past, but she never softened the present either. Her standards were high, her expectations clear, and her vision unwavering. A workplace where dignity was non-negotiable, where no one's worth was tied to the name on their badge or the floor they cleaned. Her calm defiance, her ability to move forward without forgetting, became a quiet revolution that reshaped not only the company but the people within it. Richard, for all his pride, began to listen more and speak less. He sat through her trainings, observed her meetings, and, in his quieter moments, found himself questioning not just what kind of leader he had been, but what kind of man. It wasn't an easy reckoning. There were days he bristled, days he recoiled from the discomfort of change, days he looked at Sarah and saw not an executive, but a reminder of his own failures. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that discomfort became growth. He started to ask questions instead of give commands. He began mentoring junior staff, not for prestige, but to uplift voices he'd once ignored. And though he rarely said it aloud, he knew that everything good and lasting about this new chapter was rooted in Sarah's strength. Not just her intelligence or strategy, but the quiet refusal to let bitterness write her story. In the lunchroom, on elevators, in hallway conversations, her name was spoken with a new kind of reverence, not because she had exposed corruption, but because she had redefined leadership itself. Sarah led with empathy, with discipline, with vision, and even those who had once looked down on her now looked up to her. The office felt different, warmer, more human, more alive, and though the road ahead was still long, one truth had become undeniable. The new reality of Grayson Enterprises was not just about changed policies, but changed hearts. And at the center of it all was a woman who had once been invisible, now unforgettable, not just for the power she held, but for the way she chose to use it. When the video of the confrontation leaked to the media, it took only hours for it to go viral, but the emotional impact it carried would last much longer. Though barely over a minute long, the clip captured a moment that struck a collective nerve. Sarah, calm and composed, standing face to face with a senior executive whose tone dripped with condescension and whose words, though cloaked in civility, revealed the deep prejudice that still lingers in many modern workplaces. In that brief exchange, the power dynamics of corporate culture were laid bare, until Sarah responded, not with anger or fear, but with intelligence, grace, and an unwavering resolve that instantly set her apart. Her words, simple yet firm, cut through the arrogance in the room and echoed far beyond it. "My value was never yours to measure." That line became a rallying cry, quoted in headlines, reposted across social media, and etched into the hearts of those who had ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or diminished. Within hours, the video was everywhere, on news broadcasts, Twitter threads, motivational pages, and even classroom discussions. People from all walks of life, especially women, people of color, and young professionals, flooded platforms with messages of support and shared experiences, many admitting they had never thought they'd see someone confront such blatant workplace bias so publicly, and with such poise. Sarah's courage wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet and steady, the kind of strength that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. She didn't just respond to an insult. She revealed the truth beneath it. And in doing so, she reminded people everywhere of the power of self-worth. Public praise poured in not only for Sarah's dignity but also for her intelligence. Commentators noted that her career record spoke for itself. She hadn't just worked hard, she had excelled, breaking barriers without ever asking for shortcuts. For many, she became more than an executive. She became a symbol, a living, breathing testament to what it looks like when brilliance meets integrity in the face of injustice. Influential leaders, journalists, and even celebrities shared the clip with captions that read, "This is leadership. This is what grace looks like," and Sarah didn't just win the moment, she changed the conversation. But it wasn't just the public that took notice. The company at the center of the controversy swiftly released a statement, acknowledging the incident and initiating a full review of internal policies and leadership structures. For once, the response didn't feel like a shallow PR move, it felt like a reckoning. Sarah, now at the center of a national conversation, used her newfound platform not for vengeance but for education and empowerment. In interviews, she spoke softly but clearly about the subtleties of workplace prejudice, how it often disguises itself as professional concern, constructive feedback, or cultural fit. She urged organizations to rethink not only who they hire but how they listen, evaluate, and include. She didn't attack individuals, she challenged systems. Her story became a turning point for many companies beginning to reckon with their own biases, sparking panel discussions, diversity training sessions, and leadership conversations inspired by her stance. But perhaps the most powerful impact of all was seen in everyday people who watched that video and saw themselves. Young professionals wrote about walking into work with a little more confidence. Employees shared that they finally reported that long-standing issue with their manager. Parents said they showed the clip to their daughters and sons, saying, "This is how you handle disrespect with dignity." It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a moment of validation. A moment where someone who could have stayed silent chose to speak, not for applause, but because it was right. And in doing so, she gave others permission to do the same. Sarah didn't seek the spotlight, but once it found her, she stood in it not as a victim, but as a voice. She turned a private injustice into a public lesson and transformed her personal triumph into something far greater, a movement of resilience, self-respect, and the courage to confront what's wrong, not with rage, but with wisdom. Her story didn't just call out prejudice, it redefined what strength looks like in the workplace and beyond. Through her, the world was reminded that power doesn't always wear a suit or speak the loudest. Sometimes it simply stands its ground and says with unwavering calm, "I know who I am, and I'm not afraid to be seen." Years after that pivotal day when Sarah Vance reclaimed not just her dignity, but her rightful place at the helm of the company that had once belittled her, her legacy stood tall as a testament to what true leadership looks like when fueled by intelligence, resilience, and a deep commitment to justice. What began as a humiliating dismissal, Richard, a man of arrogance and entitlement, mocking her qualifications and dismissing her worth, had quietly ignited a fire in Sarah that refused to be extinguished. At the time, the world saw her as just another woman pushed aside in a world that often rewarded power without principle. But Sarah saw something else, an opportunity not just to prove them wrong, but to redefine what success and strength could look like. When she strategically outmaneuvered Richard and legally took control, not only reclaiming what was rightfully hers, but also seizing his salary and executive perks. Many thought that was the end of the story, a brilliant act of corporate revenge. But Sarah's victory was never about revenge. It was about reform. Instead of merely enjoying her win, she chose the harder path, rebuilding the very system that had failed her, brick by brick, with ethics, equity, and empathy as its foundation. Under her leadership, the company transformed from a rigid, elitist institution into a model of transparency, innovation, and social responsibility. She implemented policies that ensured fair hiring practices, equal pay, and opportunities for underrepresented voices to rise. She built mentorship programs, especially for young women and people of color, and created a workplace where no one would be dismissed the way she once was. And most unexpectedly of all, she didn't cast Richard aside entirely. Instead, she gave him a front-row seat to the change he had never believed possible. At first, Richard resisted, clinging to his outdated views, scoffing at Sarah's collaborative approach and silently resenting her grace. But as the months passed, even he could not deny the transformation around him. He watched employees flourish under her leadership. He heard gratitude in voices that had once been afraid to speak, and slowly the man who once stood for everything Sarah opposed began to change. Not entirely, but enough to realize the weight of what he had done and the depth of what he had misunderstood. Sarah never gloated. She had no need to. Her presence, calm, commanding, and clear, spoke louder than any triumph. Her leadership was not